Thank you for joining this talk. Vaping, how the tobacco industry is destroying the future of our children. This is a real health emergency in my view. I've got no conflict of interest with regard to this presentation. The aims of the presentation, I'm going to briefly review the long-term effects of early exposure to tobacco because that's important when we're seeing e-cigarettes in context. I'm going to discuss the acute toxicity of e-cigarettes and how this differs from the effects of tobacco. I'm going to summarize what is known about the long-term toxicity of e-cigarettes and the ongoing concerns of the pediatric community. I'm going to show scientific studies that e-cigarettes are not watered down tobacco, but have their own extra toxicities. And I'm going to highlight the absolute importance of a strategy to protect children and young people, and the importance of the current position of the International Federation of Respiratory Societies. So what does early tobacco smoke do to long-term health? And it's well worth reminding ourselves of this. So here's a baby minding its own business in utero. It's nourished through the umbilical cord, but also gets exposed to adverse effects, and the genes and epigenetic makeup of the fetus will determine the response. And the results of intrauterine exposures include low birth weight, altered immune function, altered lung structure, and importantly, sensitization to later insults in adult life, including occupational insults. It's not the purpose of this talk, but occupational asthma may well also be a fetal disease and a pediatric disease. The biggest and most dangerous thing is smoking in pregnancy, and that we all know. So what can cigarettes do? So cigarettes, if the mother smokes, this is a series of animal studies. These are nicotine effects, and bear in mind that most e-cigarettes contain nicotine. As a result of nicotine exposure, there's increased collagen deposition in the fetal lung. There's increased MUC5AC expression. These beautiful alveolar tethering points that keep the airways open by interdependence are reduced in number. There's an effect on airway length. Mice exposed to nicotinic acid in these 3 time periods, gestational age 7 to 21, gestational 14 to postnatal 7, and postnatal 3 to 15. And they use the nicotine receptor knockout mice as controls. And they found the middle period, gestational day 14 to postnatal 7, was what the key period. And you can see here in this panel that the nicotine exposed mice had longer airways than normal. And this was not seen in the control groups, and was not seen in the knockout mice. There was increased airway length with decreased diameter, reduced flows, increased methacholine sensitivity, even in the absence of allergen. There was so-called dysynaptic airway growth, long airways, low FEV1 FVC ratio, and this is associated with bad outcomes in later life in asthma. What about alveolar growth? Well, this is a timed rhesus monkey study. Again, nicotine, subcutaneous nicotine or placebo from day 26 of pregnancy. And lung structure was determined at 134 days gestation after C-section delivery. Here you can see the beautiful structure of the normal rhesus monkey fetal neonatal lung. And here you can see in the nicotine exposed animals, you can see there's been failure of secondary septation. You can see these big primitive alveoli. And nicotine caused early abnormal pulmonary parenchymal and airway disease, again through the nicotinic acid receptor. I haven't shown you those data. And here you can see in another study, nicotine exposure, you can see the control, the light blue bars, the dark blue bars, the septation greatly reduced by nicotine exposure to the developing lung. What about the function of cigarettes? If mother smokes, what then? Well, this is human cord blood study in which it's shown that the cord blood mononuclear cells in the fetuses of current smoking mothers showed more reactivity to allergen. They had reduced cytokine and toll-like receptor function. and there was a correlation with later wheeze outcomes. So those babies who went on to wheeze had lower IL-13 in cord blood, whether it was RSV or rhinovirus wheeze, and there was no fall as there was in the normal baby. So early cord blood abnormal responses, later infection. Now, as an old man, I'm rather in favour of grandparents, but what role have they got to play? This is a grandmother. If she smokes, her daughter is more likely to smoke and more likely to have asthma. And her child is also more likely to have asthma, more likely to smoke. And if the baby goes on to smoke as a young person, there are synergistic effects. But very interestingly, if grandmother smokes, her daughter's children are more likely to have asthma, even if her daughter does not smoke. Now, we don't know whether it's nicotine doing this or what this is, but I think it does show very clearly that we need to be awfully careful about transgenerational effects of adverse events before we casually assume that all is lovely in the garden. So the long-term consequences of smoking, and there are also long-term consequences of environmental pollution and others, is low birth weight and prematurity, altered immune function on cord blood, airflow obstruction and impaired alveolar growth, all seen at birth. There's a persistent poor trajectory of airway growth, and there's long-term risk of COPD, more rapid decline, sensitization to other exposures later on, and increased premature respiratory, cardiac, and metabolic mortality. Not a good track record for cigarettes. So what are e-cigarettes and who makes them? So here are some various samples. You can see here. Views here is owned by R.J. Reynolds Vapor Company, a subsidiary of the Reynolds America Company. British American Tobacco, Vype, they launched Vype. Blue was purchased from Lorillard, then brought by R.J. Reynolds, then sold to Imperial Tobacco. And Altria, previously known as Philip Morris, owns Mark 10 and 35% of Juuls, which are sweeping the market in North America. So the vast majority of the e-cigarette market share are brands owned by the tobacco industry. That in itself would make you be very, very dubious about what they complain and the transparency about data. These are some of the devices. There is a Juul. Doesn't it look nice, like a USB port? Very sexy. They are different ways of administering nicotine and ensuring addiction. And Juuls in particular are very cleverly engineered. So when you activate them, you get a surge of nicotine. The heating is cleverly arranged. They contain thousands of different liquids containing thousands of different chemicals. And here you can see between 2013-14 and 2016-17, the number of flavor labels doubled to over 15,000. They're largely unregulated. I know of no website where it is possible to find out the toxicity of all the compounds that are found in e-cigarettes. And this is Dame Sally Davis, a former chief medical officer, a fairly formidable intellect. She doesn't know what's in these. And if she doesn't know what's in them, how can anybody else? And if you don't know what's in them, how can you say they're safe, as Public Health England seem to feel free to do? And one of the arguments was that, oh, well, they're just flavors, things you eat and drink every day. Well, that's not an argument, because baker's asthma is caused by inhaling flour, and you get acute asthma, but the bakers who get asthma are able to eat the flour very nicely. And here are some of the devices: a Juul, an e-pipe, an e-cigar, large tank, wonderful things. But there's actually no limit to the impudence of these manufacturers. At a quick look, you'd say these were asthma inhalers. In fact, the Puffet 2 is a brand new vaporizer from a manufacturing company called Discreet Vape. It can vaporize dried herbs and concentrates as well. It advertises a new improved battery provides 75% longer life and ensures a satisfactory vaping experience for you. And of course, it allows private vaping in public. You're just taking your asthma inhaler. I am told that children in North America have been banned from taking asthma inhalers to their school for fear they're one of these things. So what is actually inhaled? And I owe Tom Ferkel some of this information. 18 different flavored nicotine and no nicotine e-cigarettes had known carcinogens and toxic chemicals detectable. Tobacco-specific impurities were detected in the majority. There were wide discrepancies between the amount of nicotine on the label on the tin and the amount of nicotine in the e-cigarette. There was bacterial and fungal contamination of multiple products. Quality control processes are non-existent or very inconsistent. And these are the source of these data. What about the passive effects of vaping? Well, we all know about passive smoking, and thankfully, governments are tightening the noose on passive smoking and protecting us from the effects of smokers. So what did this group do? They took 9 volunteers and got them to vape nicotine-containing and nicotine-free e-cigarettes. All of these volunteers were occasional tobacco smokers. Again, the nicotine in the e-cigarettes was greater than that was advertised on the tin. What they found substantial gas phase increases in a number of toxic compounds, and in the urine of those who were passive recipients, they found evidence of nicotine, cotinine, and other compounds. And I would put to you that the passive inhalation of this stuff is something that we want to avoid. Who uses what? This is really terrifying. USA high school students. The grey line is the use of cigarettes. The red line is the use of e-cigarettes. And look how the use is climbing. And note firstly that cigarette use was declining before vaping took off. And cigarette use has not declined further since vaping took off. This is not a case of, oh, they smoke anyway, so it doesn't matter if they vape. This is a whole new population being exposed to substances of addiction. So what do we know about the acute toxicity of e-cigarettes? Let me tell you a cautionary tale. Once upon a time, as all the best children's stories start, a 16-year-old boy was brought to the emergency department. He was previously completely fit. He was in acute respiratory distress and progressed rapidly from conventional ventilation to high-frequency oscillation to veno-venous ECMO. And he was given the usual sort of cocktail of stuff, intravenous antibiotics, a macrolide, antifungals, and steroids, and he slowly recovered. A bronchoalveolar lavage while he was on assisted respiration showed 20% eosinophils. And that is his first CT scan, and you can see there are areas of ground glass shadowing. The scan is actually diffusely abnormal, but with some more serious abnormalities. And when he was extubated, my friend J.S. Batt in Nottingham got a call saying, please take over the management of this newly diagnosed asthmatic. And J.S. of course said, this is nonsense. Asthma does not present for the first time at the age of 16 with a respiratory illness so severe that you end up on ECMO. It doesn't happen. Something else is going on. And of course he was right. The spirometry was restrictive, not obstructive. There were no infectious positive cultures. And it turned out that this young man had been experimenting with vaping, with over-the-counter vaping liquids, 2 of them. And JS did a skin prick test to these liquids. There was no acute wheal and flare reaction, but 8 hours afterwards, there was a brisk drop in his lung function. He was discharged with a planned steroid taper, but deteriorated. And because of his deterioration and concerns about the diagnosis, he had a second CT scan and a surgical biopsy. There's the second CT scan. You can see some of the areas of dense ground glass have cleared, and some new ones have appeared. And the denouement there is the lung biopsy, and you can see a lot of inflammation. You can see hyaline membranes. He'd previously used cannabis, but not for a year. He'd used 2 commercial over-the-counter e-liquids and had evidence of serum IgG and IgM antibodies to these e-liquids. And the final diagnosis was a life-threatening hypersensitivity pneumonitis secondary to e-cigarettes. And that's been published in Archives. So other things can happen. This is the Jeff Drazen horror show of some of the burn and blast injuries that you can get. One of them seems to have disappeared, but these are when the e-cigarette devices malfunction acutely. This unfortunate character fractured his jaw. You can see some nasty injuries there. But there's also what we call acute e-valley, e-cigarette and vaping induced acute lung injury. So what is this? You have to have a history of e-cigarette or vaping product use in the 90 days before symptom onset. The presentation with respiratory, but maybe gastrointestinal and constitutional symptoms. Pulmonary infiltrates or opacities are seen on chest imaging. No alternative causes identified. This is a diagnosis of exclusion. So there needs to be a negative viral panel, including a negative COVID-19 test. It's a diagnosis of exclusion. And perhaps we ought, rather than calling it e-valley, it ought to be EVALD, e-cigarette and vaping associated lung disease, because there are many more lung diseases than just acute lung injury. Current definitions also of e-valley imply that if you have a preceding respiratory disease, it protects, which is obviously nonsense. We need also, of course, to avoid over-attribution. Just because somebody smoked an e-cigarette and they're ill doesn't necessarily mean that is causal, but it may be. I shall come back to this as a practice point. How many of you actually ask young people, do they use e-cigarettes? So EVALD, I think, is a more accurate umbrella term, embracing multiple causes. I would suggest 3 categories: probable EVALD, a positive history of vaping, no other cause identified; possible EVALD with a positive history of vaping, but other causes may also be implicated, but this e-cigarettes may be a second hit; or unexplained lung disease with e-cigarette exposure denied; and possibly, does it exist, passive EVALD, that you've acquired it from passive passive exposure to these devices. And this is a paper recently published. What about diagnostic accuracy? So this group took 23 patients with lung biopsies and autopsies, and the lung biopsy findings in this small study all showed acute or subacute lung injury, diffuse alveolar damage, or organizing pneumonia. And you can see here in this panel, you can see here hyaline membranes, foamy macrophages filling the air spaces, fibroblastic proliferation in the airways, proliferative here and organizing diffuse alveolar damage, and an organizing pneumonia. You can see this bud of tissue here at higher magnification. 2 of the autopsies, in fact, of the patients who were thought to have e-cigarette acute associated disease did not. And of course, one of the difficulties of this autopsy study are the findings are confounded by iatrogenic damage. These patients will all have gone to the ICU, they'll have been given oxygen, steroids, positive pressure ventilation, they'll have been at risk of nosocomial infection, and we all know that these have effects on the lungs. And there was only variable agreement between the pathologists and the clinicians about the case classification. And here are some more images that you can see. You can see some pigmented macrophages here, more fibroblastic proliferation, fibrin and macrophages, bronchopneumonia, probably related to ventilator-acquired pneumonia, hyaline membranes, fibrosis, and bleeding. A lot of stuff going on in the lungs. And they concluded that diffuse alveolar damage was a feature of e-valley, but was non-specific, and there were also other features of e-cigarette induced damage. Sometimes you can find alternative diagnoses, which may be iatrogenic, and multiple different causes may make variable contributions to an individual case. Interestingly, use of e-cigarettes alone or also with tobacco showed a greatly increased risk of COVID-19 compared with non-users, and this was suggested to be due to upregulation of the ACE2 receptor to which COVID binds. And certainly if you see a child with unexplained and unexpected diffuse alveolar damage, consider if e-cigarettes may have contributed. And it's a real epidemic. You can see until COVID overtook us and all the reporting went to that, you can see, just look how that is, they are spiraling upwards. There are numerous different ones. Acute eosinophilic pneumonia, which may be a relatively rapid event. BAL eosinophilia, treat with oral corticosteroids. You may see an organizing pneumonia after longer periods of vaping, also may require ventilatory support. A lipoid pneumonia with a characteristic crazy paving appearance with lipid-laden macrophages. There's another that's disappeared. The 53-year-old woman, this is an important case, she was an e-pipe user, presented with respiratory distress. There's her CT scan with consolidation and nodules. You can see on the biopsy that these empty vacuoles where lipid has been leached out in the preparation. You can see vacuolated macrophages, and she recovered after a prolonged course of steroids from her lipoid pneumonia. And finally, alveolar hemorrhage from intense use. The diffuse alveolar infiltrates, hemoptysis, and a hemorrhagic lavage. This is a case in a 28-year-old woman who smoked and vaped, developed acute respiratory failure. That was her CT scan with bilateral, very dense consolidation and some ground glass shadowing. And the pearl stain for iron on a biopsy, you can see these blue, beautifully stained macrophages. And she eventually recovered after ECMO, corticosteroids, and rituximab. I'm not quite sure what the indication for the rituximab was. So multiple lung diseases. Importantly, not all of them are related to cannabis. 80% they've cut the devices with cannabis, 20% they haven't. I wouldn't expect you to read this through, but there are in fact multiple different causes. And cannabinoids, as I said, are not always in play. The liquids are dangerous on their own. I would also ask you, is it sensible from a public health perspective to have devices circulating amongst young people that can be cut with cannabis and cause such carnage in the lungs? And again, as a history point, if you see a funny respiratory illness, ask yourself, could it be e-cigarettes? And I would strongly commend this paper to you. And this is a case report from Thorax, again, an adult man who used e-cigarettes. You can see he's got substantial lung damage and pneumothorax on the right, diffuse ground glass shadowing. It's difficult to believe that these lungs are going to get better. So in summary, the acute toxicity of e-cigarettes is greater than tobacco. And if the acute toxicity is greater, how can you be complacent about chronic toxicity? What do we know about the long-term toxicity of e-cigarettes? Well, this is Sir Richard Doll, a great man, and this is a lung cancer. And Sir Richard, it took many decades before Sir Richard Doll could show that smoking caused lung cancer, and many years before everyone was convinced. Now it's an article of faith. We know that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer, but it took a lot of proving. And why? The industry, the same people who are now manufacturing vapes, did its best to hide the truth by suppressing data and sowing confusion, by lies and obfuscation. Even now, many decades after Sir Richard's discovery, many years after his death, we are still making new discoveries about adverse tobacco effects. And we cannot be reassuring about long-term toxicity, especially when acute toxicity is greater than tobacco. So I would challenge those who are going around saying e-cigarettes are 95% safer than tobacco to tell me how on earth they can make that statement with any comfort. We don't yet have the long-term studies, and until we have them, we have to be cautious. So what have we learned from basic science? Well, I want to start with to go through a number of studies, and the message of all of them is firstly that e-cigarettes are themselves damaging as tobacco, and secondly that e-cigarettes are not a sort of watered down version of tobacco. They have their own individual toxicity. And remember how many thousands of different chemicals there are, how many thousands of different compounds. We haven't even but scratched the surface in terms of testing them all. So one of the curious discoveries was that vitamin E was high in bronchoalveolar lavage from patients with E-valley. So in this study, 30 mice were exposed either to air as controls, vitamin E, or the control of propylene glycol vegetable glycerine. And they achieved, by exposing them to vitamin E, they got BAL vitamin E levels that were very similar to those in vapors. They showed evidence in the BAL of inflammation with a leak of albumin, mononuclear cells, lipid-laden macrophages. Here you can see in the mice, you can see cells absolutely laden with lipid. Clusters of lipid-laden macrophages were seen on lung section, and this was consistent with the human lipoid pneumonia that has been well described as a consequence of e-cigarette use. What about bacterial adherence? I'm going to come to the immunosuppressive properties of e-cigarettes in a moment. These are Jonathan Griggs' data. He shows that pneumococcus binds to epithelial cells via the PaeCH receptor. And vaping upregulates the PaeCH receptor in epithelial cells in vitro. So here you can see the PaeCH receptor, pre-vaping, post-vaping, up go the vape exposure, up goes the receptor numbers. And vaping increased pneumococcal adherence to epithelial cells in vitro, and this effect was blocked by the PaeCH receptor inhibitor CV3988. So here you have control adherence, electronic cigarettes without nicotine, e-cigarettes with nicotine. Note how this goes. The adherence goes up. With the control CV3988, no effect, and it blocks the effect of both of the e-cigarettes. So with or without nicotine, these things are causing pneumococcus to bind to the respiratory epithelium. And the hypothesis is that this will increase your susceptibility to infection, particularly taken in the context of the immune defects that you may find with e-cigarettes. What about this, about tissue destruction, murine emphysema? So in this study, they took 6-week-old Sprague-Dawley rats. There were 4 groups. They exposed them to room air, subcutaneous nicotine, e-cigarette vapor, and cigarette smoke. And they determined emphysema with quantitative lung histology. And here you can see in the top left, room air. This is the effect of nicotine, subcutaneous nicotine. You can see the emphysema produced. Here is e-cigarette vapor, here is tobacco smoke, and there is no difference between nicotine, e-cigarettes, and cigarette smoke in terms of the enlargement of the alveolar air spaces and reduction in capillary count. All 3 interventions were equally damaging to the lung. Though, of course, this and all sorts of studies are criticized because there's no standard e-cigarette model. Well, there is no standard e-cigarette, as I've shown you. There are tens of thousands of e-cigarettes, and 7 maids with 7 mops couldn't study them all. What about tissue hypoxia? So 23 occasionally smoking adults were given a single vape exposure, and transcutaneous PO2 was measured before and after. And you can see here is the placebo, here is the effect of vaping, a fall in transcutaneous PO2, which recovers. Serum CC16 was elevated, implying lung inflammation. The mechanism of this was not determined, but thought likely to be VQ mismatch in the lungs. What about macrophage function? We know that alveolar macrophages are one of the key early innate defense mechanisms of the lung. And in this group studied alveolar macrophages in vitro, and they showed that macrophage apoptosis, programmed cell death, and necrosis was increased by vape condensate. Lower doses, not sufficient to destroy the macrophages, increased reactive oxygen species and impaired phagocytic function. So here you can see reactive oxygen species, e-cigarettes, nicotine-free e-cigarettes. This is a logarithmic scale. Look at the huge increase in oxidative stress caused by these devices. And these devices are therefore, there's at least the potential, if not the actuality, of pro-inflammatory and immunosuppressive effects. And I've said a little earlier on that e-cigarettes are not dilute tobacco. So this is a research bronchoscopy study, BAL and brushings. They studied smokers, vapors, controls who did neither. They also did some murine studies. And they found on their studies that 300 proteins were differentially expressed in smokers and vapors, of which 113 were exclusive to those who vaped. E-cell liquids entered cells and affected membrane fluidity and protein diffusion. Here you can see in this volcano plot the genes that were up and down regulated by smokers and vapors. Of course, there is a commonality, but you will see black dots that don't overlap red dots and vice versa. They have overlapping toxicity, but they are not identical. And here you can see, for example, if you look at smokers, 125 exclusive proteins, 26 in common with vapors, 33 who are upregulated by vapors only compared with smokers, and 80 compared with non-smokers. What about the innate immune system? I've already shown you data about bacterial adherence and macrophage function. In this study, they did quantitative proteomics and induced sputum in smokers, vapors, and normal subjects. Again, with increased oxidative stress with e-cigarettes, increased neutrophil elastase and matrix metalloproteinase activity, increased neutrophil and net-associated proteins and change in mucus composition, and peripheral neutrophils, so increased netosis in e-cigarette users. And you can see the pathways. The yellow pathways are modulated by both tobacco and e-cigarettes. The red pathways by tobacco only. The green pathways by e-cigarettes only. And you can see a large number of important innate immune system pathways that are only modulated by e-cigarettes. We cannot afford to be complacent about these devices. Another study on innate immunity, non-smokers, tobacco smokers, vapors, nasal inoculation with attenuated flu virus, and collected epithelial lining fluid, lavage and scrapes from the nose, urine and blood. And the findings, the genetic readouts were very different for smokers and vapors. So here, if you look at these plots, there's e-cigarettes, there's tobacco, there's non-smokers. There's very different e-cigarettes and tobacco, and you can see it. You can see again, same color codes, different genes regulated and upregulated. They are not the same thing. E-cigarettes have their own potential toxicities, their own potential harmful effects, not shared by tobacco. A bigger picture is being built up by the basic scientists. These things are dangerous in their own right. The next finding, they looked at antiviral defenses, and these were impaired, and impairment was worse by vaping than tobacco. Vaping reduced immune gene expression, cytokine and chemokine release, and influenza viral specific IgE. What does this mean for other viruses? What does this mean for COVID? So here you can see IL-12P40, non-smoker. It's reduced by e-cigarettes, but not by cigarettes. Here's IL-6, again reduced by e-cigarettes. Interferon, a key antiviral protein defense, reduced by e-cigarettes. I would be very worried if I just had a jolly good go of vaping and then met a nasty virus. So the innate immune system in this cartoon, increased net associated proteins, adverse impact on cell redox balance, increased MUC5B and 5AC. You can see here the release of all these disagreeable things, netosis, elastase, all sorts of disagreeable things from the neutrophil. There's also, not shown on this cartoon, the effects of macrophages. So how should we respond to this? Are they safe? Can we be complacent about what's happening to our children? What are the facts? Well, we do not know what is being inhaled with these nicotine delivery devices, but we do know the effects are not just a weakened version of tobacco. They have their own brand of harm. Those are facts that are incontrovertible. Nicotine is in e-cigarettes. It's a drug of addiction and on its own is poisonous to the developing lung and elsewhere. That is a fact that is incontrovertible. The evidence that vaping is a gateway to smoking cessation and being marketed as such is simply not there. And I'll show you some of those data in a moment because they are very, very, very underwhelming. But in any way, is it a gateway or not? Are cigarettes a gateway to tobacco smoking? Frankly, I couldn't care less. I really could not care less. This is a clever move by the tobacco industry to suck us into a completely non-debate and to divert our attention from the real issue, which is to stop people using e-cigarettes. Do you want your children to be nicotine addicts? If you do, that's fine, you can have this debate. But if you don't want them to be nicotine addicts, these things are dangerous. I don't care whether they're a gateway to smoking or not. There's enough going on without that to get them banned. Do we want a generation of nicotine addicts? If no one progressed to tobacco, if tobacco vanished off the face of the earth, is nicotine addiction desirable? Smoking cessation. This is what we hear. So smoking cessation, this is where e-cigarettes come into their own, not. So here we have nearly 900 patients randomized to nicotine replacement of their choice or e-cigarettes of their choice. Ah, wow. 1 year abstinent rate, twice as good for e-cigarettes. However, look at the small print. 80% of those assigned to e-cigarettes were still using them at a year of age, a year after the study. They just swapped one vice for another. The accompanying editorials pointed out that standard pharmacotherapy with bupropion and nicotine replacement therapy had twice as good rates, had much better rates than e-cigarettes use. Varenicline 27%. And Jeff Drazen in his editorial suggested the banning of all flavorings from e-cigarettes, a point to which I return. This is a pragmatic trial of smoking cessation. They randomized them to usual care plus one of either free nicotine replacement or free e-cigarettes or free nicotine replacement with some money incentive, or free nicotine replacement with a deposit that can be reduced for failed milestones. So what happens? Seems like this computer's frozen. The answer is money talks. E-cigarettes are not recommended by NICE as aids to smoking cessation. And you can see here, in terms of whether you look at the intention to treat or the engaged cohort or what, in each case, if you pay people to stop smoking, it's more effective than giving them free e-cigarettes. And this is a Cochrane review, and I just want to draw your attention to this because it's just come out. What does it say? Moderate certainty that nicotine e-cigarettes are better than nicotine replacement therapy or no nicotine e-cigarettes in smoking cessation. No evidence of harm of e-cigarettes in a 2-year follow-up. There was no comparison with pharmacological aids like varenicline. And Jürgen Vesper, in a letter to the ERJ, pointed out the flaws in this. No support for this in population studies. Many stay on e-cigarettes after so-called quitting. Harm data were not considered. And they saw no reason to change practice. And guess what? One of the authors and one of the reviewers had a conflict of interest with regard to the tobacco and vaping industry. Can the leopard change their spots? They're already trying to buy experts to say how wonderful e-cigarettes are. And before you swallow this Cochrane review whole, read this letter in the European Respiratory Journal. If this is smoking cessation, is this how you market it? E-cigarette marketing themes have nothing to do with smoking cessation. They're similar to cigarette advertising, including focusing on freedom, rebellion, and glamour. A variety of unsubstantiated health and cessation messages. Social media has become a prominent conduit for marketing and advertising these, and underage vapers can buy them easily as anything from websites. So I'm afraid I think the tobacco industry, the vaping industry, talks with forked tongue when it talks about marketing these things to help people quit smoking. It isn't. It's marketing them to make nicotine addicts so they can go on making money. And I owe this to Gareth Tudor Williams, who saw this in a Guardian article. Our mission, this is BAT, British Tobacco, stimulating the senses of new adult generation. Tobacco giant bets £1 billion, watch my lips, £1 billion on influencers. That is the young and glamorous of both genders with more beauty than brains to boost more lung-friendly sales. Smoking is gradually falling out of fashion. BAT is pinning its hopes on younger users of e-cigarettes and nicotine pouches. £1 billion on influencers. Is that how you advertise something for smoking cessation? Has any of you ever seen a nicotine patch advertised in this way? A nicotine patch on a naked shaped arm? I really don't think so. The marketing strategy I would put to you is not as an aid to smoking cessation, but as a means of getting the young addicted to nicotine. What about Instagram? This study looked at nearly 250,000 posts over 4 years, and vaping hashtags were used thousands of times more than the FDA warnings. And indeed, when the FDA put out a warning, suddenly the likes for the vaping hashtags increased. Pods with a nicotine surge was mentioned more often, and underage followers are recorded to these posts. So here you are. If you can see, the bigger the circle, the more posts they're getting. So flavors, promotions, user experience, device. If you look very, very carefully, right in the middle, you can see a yellow with a hashtag about the real cost of vaping. Those are the anti-vaping posts. That tiny little dot, one ha'porth of sack amongst ha'porth of bread amongst this monstrous deal of sack, for those of you who know Henry IV. Tiny. And what about these flavors? Why have we got these flavors? Surely they are for targeting the youth. And the FDA has indeed declared youth vaping an epidemic, announcing an investigation and new enforcement. And the Commissioner Scott Gottlieb said, we must do more to stem what I see as an epidemic of the use of e-cigarettes amongst teens and deeply disturbing trends that show no signs of abating. The FDA won't tolerate a whole generation of young people becoming addicted to nicotine. And I completely agree. And the e-cigarettes manufacturers have been accused of deliberately targeting children and young people by the FDA. And no surprise there, because that is exactly what they are doing. What about the Federation of International Respiratory Societies? It's a collaboration of 9 international professional organizations, and these are their recommendations. Electronic nicotine delivery systems should be considered tobacco products and regulated as such, including for taxation. The sale of e-cigarettes to children and young people must be prohibited by all nations, and those bans must be enforced. And I would add that if you sell, you must know you're going to be caught. All forms of promotion must be regulated, and all advertising and media should accessible to children and young people should cease. I would actually say all advertising should cease. Ban flavourings, regular surveillance to better understand the scope and health threats of these products. But what I would say is I am not interested in those who say, oh, prove to me that these are unsafe. No, I know of no sensible biological model whereby inhaling hot chemicals is anything other than a bad idea. You show me that they are safe, and you can't. So I personally believe that e-cigarettes and tobacco cigarettes should be treated exactly the same way. E-cigarette advertising and sales to children should be banned, and there should be stiff penalties and the certainty of being caught. We should have plain packaging with health warning that the consequences of vaping are unknown. We have plain packaging for cigarettes. Let's do the same for vaping. Let's ban vaping in all public places, because otherwise you have an unpaid army of vape promoters. And frankly, I believe letting people vape in front of children is like making a paedophile the head teacher of the local school. So my take-home message: vaping is promulgated by the tobacco industry, those well-known pillars of rectitude and transparency whose integrity is unquestioned, and it is totally unregulated. As a practice point, always take a vaping history as well as a smoking history, and if you see a respiratory oddity, ask yourself, could this be due to vaping? It took decades for the long-term harm of tobacco to be detected. How long will it take us to know about vaping? If we know, and we do know, that the acute toxicity of vaping is worse, then how can we be complacent about the long term? The evidence that vaping is good for smoking cessation is underwhelming. Perhaps there may be a few adults who benefit, but it's very, very few. The evidence that they are being marketed at children and young people is absolutely overwhelming. Is there a biologically plausible model whereby vaping is good? And are we as a paediatric community going to stand by and let this happen? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. We were fooled once by the tobacco industry with tobacco. Are we going to let them fool us with e-cigarettes? I sincerely hope not. Thank you very much for your attention, and I want my grandchildren to be protected from the harmful effects of these terrible compounds. Thank you very much indeed.